Hello, welcome in everyone, our newcomers. Thank you all for stopping in, for trying to continue this conversation, listen to this conversation. I'm your host, Yvette RELLES-POWELL. I'm a student at CSUSB studying communication and environmental studies. We're just gonna go right into the land acknowledgement today. As you know, a land acknowledgement is a formal statement that recognizes and respects Indigenous peoples as traditional stewards of a given geographic area in the enduring relationship that exists between Indigenous peoples and their ancestral territories. We recognize that California State University San Bernardino sits on the territory and ancestral land of the San Manuel Band of Mission Indians. We recognize that every member of the California State University San Bernardino community has benefited and continues to benefit from the use and occupation of this land since the institution's founding in 1965. Consistent with our values of community and diversity, we have a responsibility to acknowledge and make visible the university's relationship to Native peoples. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous sovereignty and will work to hold California State University San Bernardino more accountable to the needs of American Indian and Indigenous peoples. Ashe to that. And moving on to some good news and some updates for y'all. In a past episode, we touched on the Walking While Trans ban, how it has permitted police violence against the transgender community, and the efforts being made to repeal this discriminatory statute. It is now being reported that the bill has accumulated support from 66 Assembly and 36 Senate co-sponsors. Advocates are hopeful because this accounts for the majority of the House of Representatives and the Senate that they need. Community organizers are still encouraging the public to send in endorsements of the new bill to be sent to Albany State Senate Majority Leader Andrea Stewart Cousins and Assembly Speaker Carl Heastie to garner further support from them as well. In addition, there is a 2012 story around Leon Ford, if you remember, who was shot multiple times by Pittsburgh police during a wrongful traffic stop. In this stop, Ford was not even the suspect they were looking for. The shooting resulted in Ford becoming paralyzed. However, he sued in federal court and was awarded a settlement of $5.5 million. However, this is not enough to make up for the blatant racism, the gross disregard for safety, reasoning, and humanity, which resulted in Ford losing the ability to walk with his son. But good news and well-being continues to blossom for Ford. Recently, a video circulated showing Ford's progress in therapy, his namesake walking beside him and encouraging him. This one touched my heart, for real. And still we rise, Black people, ashe. I'm going to go ahead and introduce Dr. Powell, who is going to be our moderator for today. Dr. Powell is an assistant professor of criminal justice at CSUSB. He teaches courses that include police and police systems, theories on crime and delinquency, research methods in criminal justice, and statistics in criminal justice as well. So Dr. Powell, please take it away for us.
So happy to be here hosting this event. From everything that's happened this summer, obviously police have been quite in the news, and it's really led to probably more so than ever where we've had a deeper, more prolonged, more active conversations about what to do with police and what practices should and should not be implemented, what should be done away with, and how can we reform the police for a better society. So to kind of help lead this conversation for this week, we have asked Professor Alex S. Vitale, a professor of sociology and coordinator of the Policing and Social Justice Project at Brooklyn College, and a visiting professor at London South Bank University, to speak today about his book, The End of Policing. Over the last 30 years, Professor Vitale has written about policing and consults both police departments and human rights organizations. He's the author also of City of Disorder, How the Quality of Life Campaign Transformed New York, and The End of Policing. So Professor Vitale is a noted writer. He has written in Police Society, Police Practice Research, Mobilization, and Contemporary Sociology, and frequently contributes to ongoing discussions of policing, as appeared many times in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Guardian, the Nation, Vice News, Fortune, USA Today. Thank you again, Professor Vitale, for being here, and I'll leave it off to you to go ahead.
Great. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of your ongoing conversation about these, a whole range of really important questions that people have been struggling with this summer. I mean, who thought this was the summer we were going to have a year ago, right? I know I certainly didn't. So it's a good time for critical reflection on a whole host of issues. And I certainly didn't imagine in May that we were getting ready to see a kind of explosion of civil rights advocacy, Black Lives Matter, defund the police, et cetera. Even though I have spent much of the last 3 years traveling the country working with groups in cities all over the place. I've been in about 20, 25 cities a year. Watching this movement kind of percolate largely under the radar of the mainstream media. And even I was surprised about the level of activity, the intensity of resistance, and also kind of the uniformity of the political focus. In the wake of the police killings of Mike Brown and Eric Garner and Tamir Rice and Sandra Bland and so many others, we were told 5, 6 years ago, don't worry, policing is going to get fixed. And the Obama administration, big city mayors, police chiefs rolled out a whole set of reforms that they said were going to fix the problem. And there was a lot of support for a lot of these reforms, including among people who were out protesting 5, 6 years ago. Things like body cameras, improved training, anti-bias training, more community policing, de-escalation training, mental health training. There was an initial embracing of a lot of these ideas, along with efforts to hold individual officers accountable for police abuse, violence, misconduct, corruption, etc. But what we've seen over this period is that despite the implementation of a lot of these recommendations, very little has changed. The officers who were involved in the death of George Floyd had implicit bias training, mindfulness training, de-escalation training. They were wearing body cameras. They had a duty to intervene, that they had received special training. They were operating under a use of force policy that said sanctity of life had to be a primary consideration. And none of it made any difference. In fact, Minneapolis had kind of been a shining star for a whole set of what we sometimes refer to as procedural justice reforms. They even issued a report in 2018 outlining all the amazing training and oversight programs they had put in place, and it just hasn't helped. And this is true across the country. The number of police killings has not gone down. And when we talk to people about their experience of policing, especially in the most heavily policed communities, no one is singing the praises of the police, unfortunately. This has not generated substantial changes in the way policing occurs. And we can see that police continue to make about 10 million arrests a year, many of them of a very questionable nature. So how do we get into this mess? Why is it that we continue to see Democrats in Congress, mayors across the US saying, well, we're going to fix this with more implicit bias training, more de-escalation training, more money for body cameras, and yes, some changes to use of force policies like a ban on chokeholds, for instance? Why is it that they have not listened more attentively to the demand from the streets, which has been to rethink our reliance on policing in substantial ways? There weren't any signs being held up in the last 2 months calling for more training, more body cameras, more police community meetings. The signs to defund the police don't capture the full range of what people are talking about. It's something that could fit on a cardboard sign or on a Twitter hashtag. And what people are really talking about is producing new mechanisms for creating public safety that don't rely on armed police. But why are so many political leaders in both parties at all levels of government so resistant to this idea? Well, I think there are a few reasons. One is that most of these politicians this has been true over the last 40 or 50 years, have been committed to a kind of neoliberal austerity politics. And by that I mean they have basically capitulated to the pressures of global competition by deciding that all they can do is subsidize the already most successful parts of the economy, the most successful economic players, in hopes that they will become so fabulously successful that some of the wealth that they generate will trickle down to the rest of us. So we see that many major corporations in the United States pay no taxes. Some even have a negative tax rate where they receive benefits from the federal government in excess of any taxes they pay, direct subsidies. We see at the local level, the subsidizing of downtown real estate deals, the subsidizing of corporate headquarters. You see Amazon going around the country trying to get bidding wars going to see who will give them the most money to operate in their city. But this process has not produced any trickle down. What it's produced instead is mass homelessness, mass untreated mental health and substance abuse problems, mass economic precarity that's driven people into black markets of drugs and sex work and stolen goods and pirated goods. And instead of actually trying to address those problems, we have seen politicians attempt to manage them through criminalization. So I got involved in this work initially in the early 90s in California, in Northern California, in relationship to the issue of homelessness. I had trained to do, economic development and housing policy, and that's what I was doing for the Homeless Coalition. But at that time, we were seeing a massive increase in the criminalization of homeless people. And my boss at the time asked me to look into this, and it was clear to me that what was happening was that the city of San Francisco, like a lot of cities, had basically given up on the possibility of actually housing people, and instead had turned the problem over to the police to manage. And this should be understood as a kind of political failure. That in fact, whenever we see a problem turned over to the police to manage, we should be asking ourselves, well, what political problem is that solving for someone? Who's benefiting politically from that arrangement? What is it that's not being addressed as a result? So there's another reason, I think, that so many politicians have been unwilling to take the demands on the streets seriously and continue to support these, what I consider largely superficial procedural reforms. And that is that they're committed to a kind of liberal worldview that says the law, when properly enforced, automatically benefits everyone equally. And what procedural justice calls for is to create a police force that is more professional and unbiased and transparent and accountable, so that the police can more successfully carry out their law enforcement duties. Now, this sounds good on the surface, and it leads to things like more training, more resources for police, more community policing, more body cameras, the kind of stuff we've seen from the Biden camp and from the Democratic leadership in Washington and from many mayors across the country. But the problem is that this really misunderstands the nature of the legal systems in which we operate. These systems don't automatically benefit everyone equally. There's a famous 19th century saying that the law in its majesty forbids both the rich and the poor from sleeping under bridges, stealing bread, and begging in the streets. But of course, the rich don't need to do these things. Only the poor do. And these laws criminalize poverty in a way that allows a system of economic exploitation to just keep chugging right along without substantial challenges. And we can see this even more clearly today in the war on drugs. We've had this war on drugs for 40, 50 years, and we know that it has done nothing to produce public safety or improve public health because it was never designed to do that. Instead, it was part of a rancid, racist politics developed by the Nixon administration to try to lure historically Democratic white voters in the South from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party in the wake of the successes of the Civil Rights Movement. Nixon and his advisors got together and said, we need something that will allow us to signal to these white voters that the Republican Party is going to be the new home of racism and racial animus. We can't bring back Jim Crow, but we can create mass criminalization of communities of color instead. This is not just speculation. People in the Nixon administration who were a part of these meetings have come forward and said that this was about the criminalization of communities of color for political purposes. And that's exactly how it's functioned. We've had this war on drugs for all these decades. No lives have been saved. No one's been prevented from getting drugs. Drugs are cheaper, of higher quality, and more widely available than they've ever been. We have overdoses through the roof. Any young person in the United States can get any kind of drugs anytime they want them. I'm sure every young person on this meeting today knows who they would call if they wanted to try to get illegal drugs, even if they have never had any interest in being involved in that kind of activity. Everyone knows who they would call to get the ball rolling on that. The war on drugs has been not a problem of procedural justice, but a problem of substantive justice. It is inherently unjust. So we don't need to solve the problems of the racial disparities of the drug war by giving narcotics units anti-bias training. Instead, we need to rethink why we have turned the problems of drug use over to the police to manage. This is not the only way we could possibly manage this. We can look at other countries like Portugal that have decided to take police out of the drug business. They have decriminalized all drugs, and the consequences have been very positive. Overdoses have declined. The transmission of communicable diseases have declined. Usage rates of drugs have declined. And civilization has not collapsed as a result of this. We've put ourselves in this situation of thinking about the relationship between the police and the law in this completely uncomplicated way, that the police are just law enforcement officers enforcing laws that benefit everyone equally. Instead, we need to think concretely about whether or not these laws really serve the public interest, whether or not we need to actually rethink the mission of policing. So let's look a little bit more at some of these procedural reforms that have been held up as the solution to our problems. Things like implicit bias training that's in the current Democratic House of Representatives bill. It rests on this premise that the problems of racism and policing are about individual level, unconscious discretionary decision making. But this can't possibly be the case, that all the problems can be reduced to this, or frankly, any of them. First of all, this research about implicit bias imagines that this is all something that is unconscious and unintentional. And it's based on research that shows that when we put people in a laboratory setting and we show them images of different colored faces and give them little buttons to push, you know, that they show a slight preference for lighter faced images than darker ones. But they've never been able to show that the way someone scores on this test is actually reflected in their behavior. And they've also never been to show that the kind of anti-bias training they give people affects people's behavior in any meaningful way, especially police officers. In fact, most police officers find the training ridiculous, insulting, and offensive, and in some cases, use of force against people of color increases after departments have implemented this kind of training. And that's for a few reasons. For one, we have a problem of explicit racism in American policing. When we look for it, we find it. The chat rooms, the Facebook pages, the online messaging, the conversations between officers that get caught on tape, the tattoos on officers that have racist themes, the officers who've been found to be members of white supremacist organizations. But we can't reduce the problem to that either. Not all police officers are racist. Police in the United States are increasingly diverse. But there's a problem of structural racism. And it takes this form. It takes the form of elected officials turning the problems of Black and brown communities over to the police to manage, rather than coming up with better, less punitive and coercive and violent alternatives. And this is really the problem with community policing. It sounds good at first glance. Who doesn't want the police to have a better knowledge of the community, to talk to community leaders about the problems of the community, to come together to develop solutions? But this premise that we can bring the community to the police has a few major problems to it. First, when we look at how this is actually implemented in places like Los Angeles, where there's a new book called The Limits of Community Policing, based on years of field work in community policing settings in Los Angeles. And what they found was the community is what the police say the community is. The police choose the community leaders that they want to be in dialogue with. They set up community meetings in ways that encourage the participation of some and not others. When you go to these meetings, there are rarely ever any young people, any homeless people, any people who've had problems with substance abuses, mental health problems. Mostly it's landlords, small business owners, religious leaders, and some of the most conservative elements in the community who don't challenge the fundamental legitimacy of using police to solve community problems. They're supporters of the police department primarily. The other problem with community policing, though, is the fundamental idea that the community should bring its problems to the police for them to solve. But what tools do the police have to solve our community problems? Guns, handcuffs, pepper spray, tear gas. These are not the tools to solve our community problems. They don't have access to affordable housing. They don't have access to high quality mental health and substance abuse problems. They don't have access to summer jobs for our young people, better schools, more employment opportunities. They don't have any of those tools. They have the tools of violence, coercion, and criminalization. And therefore, even when they are attempting to address very real community problems, that comes with a huge burden. The burden of constant harassment, violence, and incarceration. And it also comes with a worldview that says that the world can kind of be divided up between the good people and the bad people. And the job of the police is to X out the bad people. This is kind of the thin blue line mindset. There's good people on the one side and bad people on the other side. But this is a very naive and inaccurate understanding of both the nature of crime and the nature of human beings. The world is not divided up into good people and bad people, certainly not in any way that the police can identify. How many times do we see in these community meetings someone say, well, I want you to get rid of those noisy kids on the corner who are getting in fights and selling drugs, only later to find that some of those kids are that person's nephews, cousins, etc., right? Good people do bad things. We should not be in the business of writing them off. That's not what justice looks like. So our elected officials have continued to say that it's completely appropriate to paper over profound social problems by turning it over to the police to manage. And then when the police overstep, produce racially disparate outcomes, act in an abusive and violent manner, they say, oh, well, we'll fix that with some implicit bias training and some police community meetings. But what's happened in the last few months is that no one believes that anymore. People have seen through that, and they're calling for something very different. They're demanding that elected officials invest in concrete, targeted, specific interventions that are going to make their communities safer without all the negative collateral consequences that come with mass criminalization. They want actual counselors brought back to schools instead of more money for school police. They want actual community-based mental health and substance abuse services. They want community-based violence intervention programs to help deal with family violence and youth violence out on the streets. And we have evidence to show that these interventions can work. When properly funded and well run, they've shown dramatic improvements in public safety, and no one has to be sent to prison, no one has to be harassed by the police, and no one is subjected to police violence. You know, between 1.5% of all people killed by police in the United States are having a mental health crisis. And the solution to this is not to give the police yet another form of training. We've given them so many forms of training already that they can't keep track of which training is the right training in any specific situation. Instead, we need to get police out of the mental health business. We need to create real community-based mental health services, and we need to create alternative 24-hour crisis response capacity that's staffed by mental health and outreach workers, not armed police. In the UK, if someone's having a mental health crisis, you call the National Health Service hotline and you get a medical response. And because they have national health insurance, the people who are responding have access to the medical records so that they know what the diagnosis is, what kind of medication the person has been prescribed, who their doctor is, so that they know what they're getting into, and so that they have information that they can use to help resolve the situation as successfully as possible. And as a result, almost no one is ever killed in one of these mental health crisis response calls. This is what the movement is calling for. In so many cities, 20, 30, 40% of the local budget goes into policing. And when we add courts and jails, it can be over 50%. It's time that we start redirecting money from policing interventions that not only are often ineffective, they're sometimes dangerous, abusive, and counterproductive, and put those into very specific interventions that people think will make their communities safer than they are today. Because ultimately, this is a movement for public safety, led overwhelmingly by people who have experienced a profound lack of safety in their lives, who have been subjected to violence, and for whom the police were not an effective response to their situation. So I'll stop there, and I'm very happy to take some questions and have some conversation about these issues. Thank you.
Well, thank you again, Professor Vitale, for taking time out of your day to speak to us here. And so I really appreciate it. I have a few seed questions, and then so I'll just kind of get things going. We'll also entertain a few questions that are submitted. So you've touched on some of these interests, right? But you've kind of talked a little bit like how do we about community involvement? The community is asking for these changes to invest in community violence interventions, in mental health, safety, fair housing, stuff like that. How do we ensure that the community is interested in advocating for these reforms at the local level? How can we encourage more activity from the public to request these changes in their own hometown?
Right. So I think it's fair to say, right, that communities are not of one mind about these things. The reality is that, because for the last 40, 50 years, people have been told the only resource they can have to address community problems is more police and more criminalization. And when communities are given a choice between more police and nothing to deal with problems of violence and substance abuse and mental health, people will generally choose police. So we have a lot of work to do at the neighborhood level to talk to our neighbors and our families and friends about what these alternatives could look like. And this is about real community organizing, and it's going on. I was recently in Salinas, California, where the Building Healthy Communities Coalition has been doing community-based organizing, not so much on an anti-police agenda, but on an agenda for how to make Salinas healthier. And it turns out policing is not really a tool that they think makes their communities healthier. It's actual health services, better quality housing, improvements in the environment, trauma counseling, community-based domestic violence programs. These are the things. So we just need to take these models, these examples, and bring them to more people and make the case that we have better alternatives than just relying on police.
Okay. So one of at the start of your talk, you mentioned that 5-6 years ago, there's a lot of advocates for implicit bias training, procedural justice training, and limiting bias, crisis intervention. All those things have been recommended or still recommended today to do that. And over the past 5 or 6 years, we haven't seen those changes, right? Because we still have examples of abuse happening. If we move towards like defunding police and investing in other aspects, whether it's fair housing, whether it's mental health crisis, whether it's crisis intervention and so on, what kind of time horizon should we expect to see in limiting community violence or improving the community as a whole?
Great. So first of all, there's been some kind of I think willful misdirection and misrepresentation of the movement, people saying, oh, they just want to, immediately eliminate all police and have chaos reign in the streets. And that's not really what anyone is talking about. There is no magic switch that someone's going to flip off tomorrow and poof, all police are gone. And then it's just, bedlam. There's no city council in the United States that's going to zero out the police budget in the next year. So everyone understands that this is about creating a process. Police exist, and what we need to do is we need to start systematically peeling off those things where we have clear alternatives and then building on that. So there are things that we could do immediately that I think would show immediate benefits. But even then, there is time. It does take time to ramp things up, to hire staff, to create programs, right? So just in the last few months, we've seen several cities decide not to redo school policing, to pull that money out and to put it immediately into hiring more counselors and, you know, coming up with restorative justice programs and other things. We could, you know, immediately start changing our approach to drugs, to sex work, and I think also to things like youth violence and domestic violence. But it will take time to ramp things up. So we need to start the investments immediately. And then when we've done research on these kinds of interventions, usually we look at like a 2 or 3 year time horizon to get a sense. So for instance, on the community-based violence interruption credible messenger movement, these are programs that hire people from the community who maybe have had a history of involvement with violence in their own lives to work with the younger generation to try to break that cycle of violence, steer young people into pro-social activities, get them access to trauma counseling and job training services, et cetera. The research shows that when we look at these 2 or 3 year time horizons in places like Chicago and New York, Baltimore, that they have shown tremendously positive outcomes, reducing shootings and homicides by like 50% during this time period, relative to other communities with similar demographics but no such interventions. So yes, I think like any intervention, we do need 2 or 3 years once things are implemented to assess where we are and make adjustments.
So, you know, if we invest in our community in this way through all these various social programs, you know, it might be reasonable that if we take money away that we should expect some sort of trade-off that's going to happen. So what could one reasonably expect as a trade-off from defunding the police and investing into other aspects of the community in terms of policing and crime?
Well, I don't necessarily accept the premise of this, right? Because it assumes, right, that policing is like the only possible tool that could be used to manage a whole variety of problems. So is it possible that if we don't, well, okay, so the premise here is that we invest in specific interventions that have a track record of success, and as we do that, we dial back our reliance on policing. Is it possible that we will see little periods of unevenness during the transition? Yes. Is it possible that some programs won't be well implemented or well conceptualized, and therefore there will be problems that need to be addressed? Yes. Does that mean then that the reason is that we don't have police? No, because what we don't have is very much evidence that shows that actual specific police interventions are very successful. For the most part, the evidence shows they're not successful. They play this background role, right? Like the fact that they exist has a kind of general deterrent effect. So what we're talking about is not immediately eliminating that, but eliminating specific functions so that we start to look like other developed countries that haven't turned every social problem under the sun over to the police to manage.
Okay. So we'll start with the first question from Q&A. This question is coming from Joseph Lake. Joseph Lake is asking, do you think the recently leaked body cam video will help or hurt the chances of conviction of the officers involved in the killing of Mr. George Floyd?
Well, I don't know. You know, video footage is only as good as the systems are in place to hold police accountable, for their actions. So one of the problems we've seen across the country is that even when we do have video footage, there are still very few consequences for the officers in most cases. So raising some real questions about the utility of body cameras as a tool for real police accountability. Also, the legal frameworks within which police operate are incredibly permissive of police violence. And finally, prosecutors, judges, and juries have been very reluctant to hold police criminally accountable for their behavior. So even when the evidence seems fairly clear to some people, juries have still refused to convict. Look at the Rodney King case. The initial state jury decision was to find them not guilty. So I think we can't rest all our hopes in the legal system, whether it's the criminal system or the civil system, to fix these things. Even if we were somehow to get rid of things like qualified immunity, or to see prosecutors more aggressively prosecute police misconduct, that won't necessarily feed back into better policing. What we've seen in the past is that when an individual officer is convicted of something, the police just say, oh yeah, that was the one bad apple, we took care of that. And there's no real feedback in terms of the systemic nature of policing. And let me just say one more thing, which is that one of the mistakes that we make in trying to address the problems of policing is that we've put too much emphasis on trying to sort of reverse engineer changes based on these individual high-profile incidents that are caught on video. So we look at what happened to Eric Garner, or we look at what happened to George Floyd, and we take that and we say, well, what could have prevented that specific incident? Well, if we'd given them a little bit better training, if they had had body cameras, if they had been fired and criminally held accountable. But this does nothing to address the other tens of millions of punitive encounters between police and the public, that some of which are fundamentally abusive and unjust, but no one got killed. It didn't get caught on camera. And the reverse engineering from these individual incidents often does nothing to address that reality. The abuse of discriminatory traffic stops, of stop and frisk behavior, of corrupt narcotics investigations, of corrupt gang policing, all of which have been huge problems in the history of California, right? None of that is addressed by just throwing one or two cops in jail because they got caught on video killing someone.
Actually, turn over to see if Yvette has a question or statement. Sorry, I didn't mean to not be inclusive, but sorry.
No, I appreciate it. Thank you. So in your book, you talk a little bit about how policing is failing to do anything about sex work or sex workers. And I just wanted to get your insight on how this sort of system of policing and this tradition of policing has impacted the LGBTQIA community, specifically people of color within that community. The research that I've come across indicates that there's this gross uptick in convictions of people of color who are from the LGBTQIA community, convictions wrongfully for loitering, for prostitution, based on language in the bill that I looked at, which is really vague, that gives them permission to take in anybody for possession of basically paraphernalia, anything related to that. So if you could just touch on that and talk to our audience a little bit about that chapter in your book.
Sure. Well, I was so pleased to hear you mention the Walking While Trans bill that is, making real progress here in New York State. And it's something that I've supported and have worked with people on. And I think it's very important. It's a step towards a larger conversation about decriminalizing sex work, but it's not exactly the same thing. So let's look at it from two perspectives. One is by creating a regime of criminalizing prostitution, it sweeps up people who are being wrongfully accused because they come from vulnerable communities that in the minds of the police are associated with sex work. So this is especially true for trans folks who the police automatically assume if they're visibly trans, that they're highly likely to be connected to the sex trade. But it also has caught up many other women, mostly low-income women of color, who are falsely accused of being involved in prostitution because they're in the wrong place at the wrong time in the minds of police. But the solution to that is not just to better tailor the laws so that they don't pick up as many innocent people. Because even when they are actually getting someone in the act, so to speak, that's no more just. So we don't want to draw this massive distinction between the criminalization of a trans person who's not a sex worker and the criminalization of a trans person who is a sex worker, because neither of those is okay. What we need is to get police out of the sex business. They should not be making these decisions about who is a sex worker and who is not a sex worker. And they should not be in charge of regulating people's sexuality. Instead, we should look carefully at certain questions of harm and think concretely about how to reduce those harms, with the understanding that sex work is the oldest profession and that nothing we could possibly do could eliminate sex work, if that was even desirable to do so. It's the same thing with drugs. There's nothing that we can possibly do to stop all drug use. Nothing. It is impossible. Americans love drugs. What we can do is we can reduce the harms. But what we've done is we've created a set of moral categories and then turned those over to the police to enforce in ways that have actually made the problems worse. Because so many of the harms that sex workers are subjected to come directly from the fact that it's illegal, that we've created these massive underground, unregulated black markets that leave people vulnerable to violence and exploitation. If we had decriminalized sex work that allowed sex work to operate like any other business, then people could say, hey, there are health and safety violations here. Or when a customer comes, you would take down their driver's license number or make a Xerox of it so that there wouldn't be any violence. You could have on-site security. You could have closed circuit television cameras. But you can't have any of that now because it all operates in this black market world where no one wants to say who they are. No one wants to be caught on camera because everything that's happening is illegal and could lead to prosecution. And we have all this concern about trafficking and juveniles. But if we bring sex work out of the shadows as legitimate businesses, then there would be much less space for trafficking and child exploitation because everything would be much more out in the open. Organized crime takes advantage of the fact that this is a black market, and so they can engage in forms of super exploitation of people. So we have this situation where we use the exploitation of children to justify the broad criminalization of sex work, and yet those same people never want to put a dime into radically expanding resources for teenage runaways. Like, what are we doing to support teenage runaways who are escaping abuse or who have been kicked out of their homes, often because of their sexuality? We have totally inadequate services for these young people. And that puts them at risk. That makes them incredibly vulnerable. If they had avenues for self-sufficiency, for earning a decent living and living independently, then many of them would not turn to sex work or be vulnerable to being pulled into sex work. So let's address the harms instead of imagining that we can turn our morality over to the police and that will just fix the problem.
Okay. So we'll move to a different question from the audience. It's from an anonymous attendee. So police culture is an integral aspect of the current systemic issue. Even when good apples want to raise awareness of bad apples, there is often little movement because the culture of policing generally results in that officer being labeled as a snitch and other officers blacklisting that officer. In the form of worse assignments, a lack of backup, and so on. How can we fix police from the inside out? And if we can, how do we do about it? How do we do it? And also, how does federalism play into this when considering federal, state, and local levels?
So that's a great question. I'm very pessimistic about this. Police culture is integral to the nature of the institution. It's not an accident. It's not, and we can just see we have 18, 19, 20,000 individual police departments in the United States that are completely independent, and yet the culture is the same in all of them. So what does that tell you? The culture is about the nature of the job. Police are violence workers. That's what distinguishes them from all other parts of government. They're who you call when you need that authorization and capacity and willingness to use violence. And with that comes a culture of insulation, of insularity, of defensiveness, because they feel like no one understands them, that they are at war with the public. And this is made worse when our politicians at all levels tell the police to wage a war on crime and a war on drugs and a war on gangs and a war on immigrants and a war on terror and a war on the poor. Well, the culture then is going to be the culture of warrior. I gave a talk in Houston a little while back, and some black and brown police officers came, and I spoke, and they asked me a question from the floor about changing the culture of the policing, and I kind of gave the answer that I just gave you, and they hung around and we talked for a while afterwards, and I said, yeah, I just don't think you can change the culture of policing. And they're like, well, yeah, we were young people who in communities where the police had treated us badly, and we thought, if we went into policing, we could change the culture of policing. And they're like, we failed, nothing changed. And I'm like, there's no fixing it. I said, look, when you were thinking of becoming a police officer, if there had also been the option of a job with the same pay and benefits, working in a local community center, coaching football and mentoring kids, which job would you have chosen? And they laughed and they're like, oh man, we would much rather have been coaching, working with kids, but there were no jobs like that. And I'm like, exactly. This is the problem, right? Those guys became part of the culture of policing, not because they were bad guys, but because the institution demanded it of them. If they had had a job working in a community center, it would have been an entirely different culture. And their behavior would have been very different. Their job would not be arresting people and using violence. And so it would just create a completely different ethos. So what I'm talking about is creating those other jobs rather than thinking we can change the fundamental nature of policing.
So I guess a follow-up to that question then is that if we have all this investment in other community resources, whether through drug abuse, whether through school intervention, community centers, and so on, how does defunding the police, or at least reducing the role of police, change violent or abusive use of force? How does it change, racial bias that happens when the culture that is built into the system? So if we take money away from the police and we put it in other aspects, how does that change unconstitutional deaths and so on?
Well, it dramatically reduces the number of encounters between police and the public. Remember, I said before that up to half of all police killings are of people having a mental health crisis. So if we quit sending the police, we save hundreds of lives every year. With no new training, no change of police culture, the police just aren't in those people's lives anymore. If we end the war on drugs, we prevent hundreds of thousands of racist encounters between the police and the public. If we get the police out of our schools, we prevent the whole school to prison pipeline that has been shown to be incredibly racially disparate in the criminalization of young Black and brown children, right? So that's how we reduce the racism and the violence, is to dramatically shrink their size, their role, their scope. Yeah. I mean, if we really were to get rid of all these wars, if we were to create all these alternatives and we still had some police force to deal with, I don't know, armed bank robbers or something, then we could talk about the culture of policing. Then we could talk about use of force practices, et cetera. But right now, it just doesn't make any sense because they've been told they're at war with the public. And that's how they behave.
Okay. So earlier in what you just said, you mentioned crisis intervention teams and police dealing with people with mental health crises. This question is coming from anonymous to 10B, asking if you oppose crisis intervention teams that have mental health specialists respond with police to potential violent mental health crisis situations.
Okay, so that's what we often call the co-response model, and it's not shown good results. It's not reduced arrests or use of force. There was like one study that showed some improved outcome, but they had implemented the creation of a whole bunch of new mental health services, to which my take on it was, okay, so the reason that worked was because they created mental health services. Well, why don't we just create the mental health services and quit sending the police? We would free up a huge amount of resources, and really, what value do the police add to these encounters? Now, people will say, well, some of these encounters turn violent, therefore we need violence workers. Well, there are two problems here. One is that there are plenty of people who receive special training working in mental hospitals, emergency rooms, and other places to deal with potentially violent people without escalating the encounter. But second, a lot of the violence is because an armed police officer has shown up. And that person is afraid of the police or angry at the police because they've mistreated them in the past, because they don't want to get arrested, because they see a gun and they think something bad is right. In the UK, I mentioned before, they don't send armed police on these calls. And so they have no suicide by cop there, which is a common phenomenon in the United States. There's probably over 100 of these every year in the United States, because people in the United States know that if they can't get themselves to commit suicide, they can call 911 and wave around a piece of pipe when the police show up, and the police will kill them. And then the police say, see, that's proof of why we need to send armed police, because that guy was violent. Well, if we were not in the habit of sending an armed police, that encounter would never happen.
I wanted to go ahead and highlight a question from our panel. Would you please comment on the connection between US military intervention abroad and how the tactics and surveillance tools used to control, suppress populations in Iraq, for example, are sometimes adopted by the US police departments, leading to further militarized policing?
Great. So I want to start a little further back. We got plenty of time, it looks like. So policing and military interventions have always been interwoven. Policing emerges mostly in the 19th century in connection to three fundamental systems of exploitation in the modern world. And these are colonialism, slavery, and the rise of an industrial working class. And colonialism in particular involves this intersection with military and policing. So the very first modern police force that most people point to, the London Metropolitan Police, was modeled after the English occupation forces in Ireland, a colonial project. And that project, that colonial policing project, is about replacing the military with a force that's more efficient, more preventative in nature, and more legitimate. So it produces less resistance. The first state police force in the United States, the Pennsylvania State Police, created in 1905, were modeled on the US occupation forces in the Philippines during the Spanish-American War. And they brought over people who had been running those colonial occupation forces to create a new state police force whose primary mission was to break the strikes that were happening in the coal and iron fields in Pennsylvania. We had our own colonial police force in the United States, the Texas Rangers, that started as a mostly military force, exterminating the indigenous population, driving out Mexican and Spanish landholders to make way for white settlement, and then turning into a police force that enforced a system of Juan Crow, very similar to Jim Crow, except for Mexicans. They did not have the right to vote. They could not use public facilities in the same way that blacks couldn't in the South. And this was enforced by the Texas Rangers. Now, my friend Stuart Schrader has written a book called Badges Without Borders that covers the more recent history of this, the interchange between US occupation forces in Vietnam, in the Dominican Republic, in Central America, and domestic policing. And he shows that there's a constant back and forth between domestic police officials, military advisors, counterinsurgency officials, all informing each other's work about how to create more efficient, more legitimate forms of crime management, counterinsurgency, and political suppression. So if you're really interested in that topic, check out Badges Without Borders. It's a great brand new book.
I could jump in and just ask a quick follow-up. Hi, it was in the dark there. You mentioned slavery as also being another important touchstone to this story. Of course, colonialism, as you just mentioned, is so important. But particularly in the US context, I wonder, can you talk a little bit more specifically about how slavery fits into the history of policing? Because I think oftentimes we hear, sometimes in a kind of dehistoricized way, the idea that we had slave catchers and we have police, and and it's this kind of straight line. And so I want you to maybe kind of tease that out a little bit, to what degree that's actually true, and how does that help us understand the US context?
Great. So as I mentioned before, modern policing emerges in relationship to colonialism, industrialization, and slavery. And not all police forces evolve out of all of them, right? So in England, they didn't have slavery in England. Their slavery occurred in other places, in the West Indies and in colonial America right before independence. slavery wasn't really a factor in the development of most European policing. In the US, it is a factor in some parts of the country much more than others. So when we look at the development of policing in Boston and New York and Chicago, it looks much more like the kind of British model informed by colonial practices and labor suppression. But when we look at the South, what we see is the direct evolution of policing out of the management of slavery. So I argue in the book that actually the first police department in the world that I've been able to find that fits the definition of a modern police department, it's professional, 24-hour, uniformed, law enforcement-oriented, civilian, is the Charleston City Watch and Guard that's formed in the late 1700s. Charleston, like most of the big cities in the South, Savannah, New Orleans, are port cities that have large, what we call mobile slave populations, which means that slaves actually worked outside the home of their owners. Very different from a plantation system, right, where there's an overseer and people live on the plantation, and you use slave catchers and slave patrols on country roads to prevent people from running away. And in some ways, that played some role in the shaping of modern rural Southern policing, but there were other factors at work there more than just slavery. But in the cities, the first police departments there, the law that they're enforcing is the law of slavery. And they're created primarily to manage this mobile slave population because of fear of slave revolts. And because they prohibited slaves from learning how to read or forming religious societies, they needed a permanent 24-hour professional force to micromanage and keep control over that mobile slave population that had to travel to docks, to warehouses, to many factories that were occurring at that time period. And so it's out of that system of managing slavery that you get these first urban police departments in the South. And I will say in the North that slave catching, the enforcement of lantern laws, the enforcement of racial segregation was also a function of these big city northern police departments as well. But that was never their primary focus, and that was not really what drove the creation of those police departments. It was more the influx of immigrants into the new industrial economy and suppressing strike activity, disorderly behavior, things like that.
Okay, I have another question from the audience here. This is coming from Emily Carrion, who says, "Thank you for your talk. It was such a clear articulation of why policing is not the solution to many of our social problems. Do you have any tips for talking with neighbors who have the view that you describe, that police equals safety? So are there any specific talking points you find effective in persuading people, especially for people who live in places where defunding police, it almost feels like a political impossibility?"
Well, I think, you have to understand the particular context in which you're speaking to someone. So the conversation might be very different in a low-income community of color than it might be in a nice white suburban neighborhood. So let's talk about the nicer white suburban neighborhood, or even a white working class neighborhood. These neighborhoods have problems. Now, the problems are not the same in all these neighborhoods. In a wealthy, whiter neighborhood, you may not have a problem of youth gun violence and armed robberies, but you have problems of drug overdoses. And these have not been dealt with by the police effectively. And I think there's an understanding in a lot of these communities that they don't really want this to be solved by the police. That they may think, oh, well, we want the drug dealers criminalized, but that's to protect our own kids who've become caught up in drugs. And they should get treatment and counseling and things like that. And I think the way to start that conversation is just to say, maybe we need an entirely different approach to the drug problem because criminalization is not working. It's the overdoses are continuing, and then talk about what the alternatives would look like. I think for drugs, people could look at the Ithaca plan. Ithaca, New York is a town in upstate New York that had a terrible drug problem. And the mayor there saw that police were not helping. So he brought people together, experts, community leaders, and said, let's develop a real comprehensive approach to the drug problem. And it included, 24-hour drug treatment options, harm reduction strategies like safe injection sites and needle exchange and targeted economic development programs. And, so there is the possibility of talking to people about maybe police are not the solution to every problem. We're not going to convince everyone. We live in a deeply divided society, and a lot of people have embraced policing as a symbol of a kind of authoritarianism, that they think that every problem can be solved with violence and intimidation. And we have a lot of work to do to try to convince people that we can actually solve problems by helping people, not by criminalizing them.
Thank you for your comments on that question. We have another question here from the audience, from Christine. They ask, what suggestions do you have for shifting the appeal of becoming a police officer as a desirable career path to careers in the kind of social services and other types of interventions that address crime? They say, I hear students say they want to be police officers and detectives or crime analysts, criminal justice majors, to fight crime and not to do social work. How do we shift their thinking to understand that they are fighting crime by doing social work?
So I think part of the issue here is what I mentioned before about those guys from Houston I was talking to. Part of it is that young people are growing up in a situation where the police department's the only place that's hiring. That there are no jobs for social workers, that there are no jobs for community workers, for mental health counselors, right? That those positions have all been cut for school counselors and coaches and things like that. So I think part of it is creating those jobs again. Part of it is just working against what we see on television all the time. These television shows, one after another, give this completely false impression of what policing is like. They imagine that what police do all day is chase serial killers and bank robbers and find little bits of trace evidence that they use to find the hidden bad guy. And this is all nonsense. Most police officers spend 95% of their time having nothing to do with anything even remotely related to serious crime. Most patrol officers make one felony arrest a year. If they make two, they're like cop of the month. It's a big deal for most of them. And clearance rates on serious crimes are very low. Most violent crime is never even reported to the police. Of that is reported, less than half is ever solved. Much of it is never even really investigated in any serious way. So we need to expose people to more about the realities of what policing really is, and also provide them alternative career paths. We've created all these criminal justice programs in part because that's who's hiring. And colleges want to create programs that come with jobs. If there was a massive increase in hiring for social workers and mental health counselors and school counselors, colleges would create programs to feed those jobs. And then young people would see, oh, look, those people are all getting jobs, and maybe that would be a good path for me.
Alex, this is Mary. I just think it's interesting that you would talk about, kind of the myths of policing, that they're these crime fighters and they go out and they make all these arrests, arrest on top of arrest. But one of the first things that happened after George Floyd died was the television show Cops, which had been on for like 30 years, which was an American staple. It all of a sudden gets canceled practically overnight. And so that gets into, the cops on TV. We've always had these detective novels and then television shows and movies and that kind of thing. How do you, what is sort of the first step of deprogramming us to believe that cops are the answer to everything? And then secondly, how do we get through the union line? Because unions in law enforcement have seem to do more harm than good.
So, yeah, I was really shocked at the canceling of Cops and maybe more importantly, Live PD. These shows were just terrible, were toxic, I think, were really perverting the whole culture. There's a wonderful podcast series called Running from Cops that goes into amazing detail about how Cops was produced and all the ways in which it misrepresented, even though it claimed to be a reality show, it completely misrepresented reality. It destroyed people's lives unjustly, etc. And I think that podcast was part of the reason that these shows were canceled, because people were clear about how harmful they were. How do we show them another way? Well, I think we've got to talk more to people about what these alternatives really look like. But it's going to be very hard because we really are going up against this massive wave of popular culture that lionizes policing in these completely uncritical and fanciful ways. And I think, we have to just keep making it a demand of this larger movement that, we have more accurate representations of what policing is really like and about how communities deal with them. The second part of the question was about, went right out of my head, sorry. Mary?
Unions.
Unions.
Yeah,
okay,
yeah.
Thank you, yeah. So, I'm a fourth generation unionist. I recently finished a second term as a vice president of my union. So I'm not in the business of trying to break unions. I think that's a strategy that's going to come back and haunt the labor movement more broadly. But there's no question these unions are a huge problem. But they're a problem, in many ways, in a political sense that we can manage at a political level. So people point to all these terrible provisions in these contracts that insulate them from accountability. But who's signing those contracts? It's local officials, local mayors, and then usually ratified by city councils. Well, we could put a stop to that. We could say, no, we're not voting for politicians who ratify these contracts. This is what's been happening in Austin. They actually got the city council to block the ratification of the union contract because it had too many sweeteners for the police, too much impunity. And along those lines, the other thing we need to do is we need to make their political activity toxic. And primarily this is about calling out politicians who take their endorsements and campaign contributions. Any politician who takes that money or takes that endorsement really can't be our friend anymore. Not just because the police union wants another, 2% in their pension, but because the police union's politics are about making them immune from accountability and also invariably supporting criminalization as a strategy. And that both takes resources that could be used in better ways off the table because it's caught up in policing, but also it justifies this thin blue line ideology, which says that the solution to our problems can be solved by violence workers. And this undercuts any argument about solving our problems by investing in people and communities in positive ways to build them up instead of tearing them down. So over the last couple of months, there's been a real movement across the country to identify those politicians who've taken that money and that endorsement and calling them out publicly. And as a result, dozens of politicians have started to renounce the money and the endorsements. Many of them going back into their campaign records and pulling out police union money and giving it away to bail funds and mutual aid projects and things like that. And I think that's the way to go. You know, we can't just give them a pass and say, oh, well, they take money from all the municipal unions. No, when the teachers union comes to lobby, they want more money for teachers and for chalk, you know. But when the police union comes to call, they want another law criminalizing teenagers and another law, you know, criminalizing drug users and another law criminalizing homeless people. And that, we can't abide by that any longer.
Another question from the audience that's also from the audience and also from one of our panelists. It's from Carolyn Eggleston and Dr. Marc Robinson, asking to speak a little bit about your chapter on the school to prison pipeline. So part of the national debate on policing is examining the roles of armed officers in schools. Are school security officers any different than other police, and do they need the same reforms? Especially since there's a debate about removing police from colleges and universities. What are your thoughts on the school to prison pipeline as well as police in education institutions?
Great. So I talk in the book about the origins of modern school policing. And it really emerges in the 90s in relationship to three phenomena. These are school reform, the kind of Texas miracle that George Bush brings in, which is to create high stakes testing, to focus the curriculum on a few core strengths, and then to implement all kinds of zero tolerance disciplinary systems. And as a result, they cut extracurricular activities, they cut counselors, and Bush said, oh, look, we can save money, bring up test scores. This is the Texas miracle, and that's part of how he got elected. Well, it turned out that the Texas miracle was a big lie, that what they did was that they took the kids who didn't perform well on the tests, they criminalized them, they drove them either into the jail system or into these reformatories, these alternative schools that were run like jails and that weren't included in the test regime. So they just criminalized the bottom 20% of test takers, and guess what? The test scores went up. And then as a result, they just denied those 20% of kids an education and drove them into the criminal justice system. So that's one factor. The other factor was the super predator myth. This emerges in the 90s from some very deeply conservative, ideologically driven academics who saw some high profile, youth violence incidents and made a bunch of demographic projections that said, oh my God, there's going to be more young people. Young people are more criminal than ever. There's going to be this wave of sociopathic youth violence, and we better start putting these kids in prison as fast as we can because that's the only thing you can do with them. And of course, they're talking almost entirely about Black and brown children. They never use that language, but that's always what they're talking about. Now, of course, every year after they made this prediction, youth crime has fallen in the United States. For 25 years straight, youth crime has fallen. But they predicted this massive wave of youth violence. They've had to recant that everything they said was based on spurious evidence, and they just cooked it up. But politicians ate it up. The conservative editorial boards ate it up. And they said, oh, we got to put police in the schools. to protect us from all these gang-banging youth who are going to shoot you over your lunch money, which never came to pass. This was a totally fake hysteria, moral panic. The third thing was the Columbine shooting. So all these things happened in the 90s. So, oh my God, every school is going to be attacked by armed intruders. So we need school police to protect our children. Well, there were armed police at Columbine that day, 2 of them. It made no difference. There were armed police at Parkland in Florida when that happened. It made no difference. Armed police have not prevented these school shootings from happening. Almost all of these school shootings happen by people within the school community, and almost always someone knew that there was a real chance this was going to happen. But there was no system in place to preventively intervene to stop this from happening. In fact, what happens is that even if someone does say something, it's turned over to the police, who actually don't have any tools to intervene. In Parkland, the police had been warned about this young person, and so they drove by the house and said, "You got any guns?" And the guy's like, "Yeah, I got guns, but they're legal." And they're like, "Okay, have a nice day." And then he went and shot the school up, right? It didn't help. We need completely different systems of early warning and intervention to deal with this. So anyway, the 90s brings in massive funding for school policing. The 94 crime bill from Clinton has money. States and local governments pour money into this. And as a result, we have a massive expansion in the criminalization of children, disproportionately Black, brown, disabled, and LGBTQ youth. How do we get out of this? It's not by turning school police into mentors, giving them more training, making them friendlier. No, it's bringing back counselors, bringing back the extracurricular activities, putting in place restorative justice disciplinary systems instead of zero tolerance ones. It's about creating family support so that children don't come to school abused, hungry, unprepared for school. That's the real solution here. In Europe, they think we're insane. They don't have school police. They would never use school police to solve problems in a school. They would actually get to the root of the problem. They would help kids and their families out.
I wanted to go ahead and follow up this question while we're on the topic of schooling. First, let me ask you, since it is a California bill, if you had heard about Proposition 13 back in March when it was going to be on the ballot. So it was going to do a lot of good in the community, we would have hoped. The premise was that large corporations such as Amazon, places like that set up shop in our communities and use our communities as their base for production and shipping, those corporations would be taxed enough so to contribute to our schools, our public services, roads, things of that nature. It was denied by the community. Reports show that every time a bill like this comes along, it's denied specifically by the community. And I just want to know, what is the misinformation that is happening? Because that would have directed a lot of money away from policing and more towards, like you said, concrete factors that would have actually improved our community. So yeah, if you would.
So I wasn't able to follow the details in this, but I've looked at some of these other propositions, including some of the criminal justice ones. And let's be clear about the fact that the finances of the anti-tax side of that argument were like 10 times, 20 times greater than the finances of the campaign to implement Prop 13, to approve it. So you've got little grassroots campaigns giving out palm cards while the other side is running TV ads all over the state, filled with misinformation about what the bill is actually about. So part of this is about these fundamental inequalities in our democracy, that basically you can just purchase election results if you're willing to put enough money into it. So we've got to do something about our electoral system that allows the buying of elections. Campaign finance reform in some form, you know, we have to continue to work on that issue. And yes, we have a lot of work to do in a lot of communities to talk about core issues of economic justice. A lot of people have, as I mentioned before, they've just capitulated to the idea that the only hope is that Amazon will become so rich that at least they can get a job for $12 an hour working in one of their warehouses. And they just don't think anything else is possible. So we have to convince people that we have a vision of a more just society where people have real economic stability in their lives, access to universal health care, free education, and we're making progress. I mean, look at the election results in the last couple of months. A lot of democratic socialists and other left insurgents are winning election around the country. So I think things are moving in the right direction at least.
Okay. Taking another question from the audience here. So this is from an anonymous attendee who says that they live in a small community that doesn't necessarily have the same obvious explicit police issues that we see in other communities. And data isn't necessarily readily available or easily digestible when they are. So it's harder to mobilize around the idea that we need to rethink some of these police strategies. And some city officials think that the call to integrate social workers means we integrate them into the police department itself, thus requiring more funding to the police. What are your thoughts on how we can navigate through communities such as mine so that there can be these shifts away from the over-reliance of police?
So, you know, the first thing is that a lot of these communities shouldn't have their own police forces to begin with. I mean, this is ridiculous that we have 19,000 police departments, 50% of which have fewer than 25 officers in them. We've allowed this, you know, anytime a little municipality can rub two pennies together, the first thing they do is hire a police officer. So policing should be done at a more regional or at least county level. And then we could have better access to information. These forces would be, you know, there would be more transparency about what's going on, and we could have more clarity about, well, what do we actually need police to do? Even in these small towns, I think there's a lot of cases of, like, everyone knows that the cops, you know, play favorites, engage in abusive behavior towards some people, even though they may be mostly kind of service oriented, but also that it's very wasteful. What are they doing? And what is it that they're doing that could only possibly be done by an armed police officer? I think if you really talk to people in those, you know, and start to get at some of that, people are like, yeah, Jimmy just sits around in his patrol car all day writing speeding tickets. Like, why do we need that? You know, yeah, Joey likes to go hang out at the you know, the diner and harass the waitresses, right? You know, whatever. I think that, in fact, in a small town, people know a little bit more clearly in some ways what police really do all day, which is not much.
I'd like to go ahead and highlight a question from our audience. They ask, which communities have the model of community services that we can look at as an example?
So there's no one like perfect place out there. We can look at places that are doing this thing or that thing. They've gotten police out of the schools. They've gotten police out of the mental health business. You know, they've gotten police out of drug enforcement. They've gotten police out of sex work. You know, in Nevada, in rural Nevada, sex work is legalized. There are no vice units. The police don't get to engage in that abusive behavior of sex workers, et cetera. And it's not perfect, but I think it's much better than if it were criminalized. In Oregon, they've created, in parts of Oregon, they've created these professional outreach units that are integrated into the 911 system. that deal with calls about someone having a mental health crisis, a substance abuse crisis, someone who's homeless, who's having some kind of a crisis, who needs help, right? And so they don't send police at all on those calls anymore. And a lot of cities are looking at this. LA, San Francisco, Albuquerque are examples in your part of the country where where governments are moving in this direction. So there are individual concrete examples, and in my book, there are hundreds of endnotes with examples from all over the country and around the world of concrete alternatives to using police in very specific circumstances.
Can I ask another question? I know you hit on it just a little bit about militarization and the police. And can you speak a little bit more about kind of that intersection between the federal government, the war on drugs, and how our cops have become so militarized where, you know, we have these big tanks going down the streets in many of our urban areas?
Right. So, you know, militarization of policing is not just about the armored personnel carriers, the MRAPs, the APCs, the sniper rifles. It's not just about the hardware. It's also about the training and the mission. We've created tens of thousands of these, or I should say thousands of these paramilitary units, SWAT teams, drug interdiction units, things like this. And we've placed them at the center of policing, but also everyday policing. As I mentioned before, our elected officials have told the police that they're waging a war on drugs and a war on crime and a war on gangs and a war on everything else. And then we're all surprised when they act like warriors. So the federal government has been facilitating this process since since at least the 1980s, but really in many ways since the 1960s with the Law Enforcement Assistance Act, the LEAA, of giving police technology as part of a mindset that says the problems of policing can be fixed with more professionalization, more equipment, more technology. That the problem is that the police are too backwards. No, the problem is that you've turned every problem over to the police to manage, and the police are violence workers. And when you give them more to do, they're going to want more violence-related equipment to do it. In part also because by relying on criminalization, they create their own opposition, right? So we've tried to prohibit drugs through criminalization, but what that's done is created a massive black market where everybody's carrying guns. And then when the police go after them, sometimes they get shot back at, and then the police say, well, now we need an MRAP and automatic weapons and grenade launchers, right? It's a vicious cycle that begins with the decision to use police in the first place that then escalates out of control. So we need controls on the transfer of military hardware, which has been occurring both through direct transfer of surplus goods and also the provision of tens of billions of dollars in grants for departments to go out on the open market and buy this stuff. And some of that's driven by kind of welfare to defense contractors in Washington. But also we need our politicians to quit declaring war on the public and to actually start addressing our community problems in ways that actually help people instead of throwing them into cages.
Thank you. I believe we have a final question from our panelist, Dr. Marc Robinson.
Hi, yeah, Dr. Vitale, thank you for all of your insights and comments.
You're most welcome.
Today. As we move towards wrapping up, I wanted to ask you if you could comment specifically about how you see race and ethnicity and certain kinds of biases and prejudices playing a role here. And I'm particularly thinking about, you know, the current movement for Black Lives Matter and how militarization of the U.S.-Mexico border, you know, have been part of this ongoing issue around policing and kind of this militarization and hyper, punitive kind focuses on particularly Black and brown bodies. And so you've talked a lot about how economics and various neoliberal policies are obviously a part of the story, but I'd like you to maybe speak a little bit more specifically to how you see kind of racial and ethnic animus also playing a role.
Sure. Well, let me talk about two specific issues that will be, familiar to folks in Southern California, which are, immigration and gangs. So I argue in the book that border policing has always been about the production of whiteness. That all the regimes to control the immigration at the border and police the border have been tied to moral panics about the racial other. The very first restrictive immigration laws in the 1800s targeted the Chinese. As the railroads linking the country become completed, which relied on a lot of Chinese labor, highly exploited Chinese labor, they're like, well, we don't want any more Chinese people. So they created the Chinese Exclusion Act. First, they said that no women could come because they didn't want them to form families. And then they said, no, we're just going to stop all immigration by Chinese folks. And the Border Patrol, which now is Customs and Border Protection, was created to patrol the Southern California border to prevent Chinese from coming to Mexico and then crossing the border into the United States. Similarly, over time, the southern border has been about the production of whiteness in relationship to Latin Americans, to mostly folks from Mexico. It's about not just keeping them out, but also letting them in under degraded circumstances. Because we've never had a closed border. They've never been able to or actually interested in closing the border. What they want is for people to come across the border in a degraded status. So usually that's by creating just the distinction between documented and undocumented workers, so that farm workers and domestic workers have no choice but to accept very low wages with no unionization and no labor protections or health and safety protections or environmental protections. So, the farm workers in the Central Valley, they don't want the border to close because then they would have no exploited workforce. At other times, they've actually created worker programs like the Bracero program that allowed people to come in legally, but only under the condition that they sign disadvantageous labor contracts, have no pathway to citizenship, and must return to Mexico. So it's just changing one system of labor regime for another, all of which exclude that population from becoming Americans. Trump's effort to close the border is about political symbolism. The border is not closed. It's not going to be closed. The wall is a joke. I think many of us have seen the pictures of people scrambling up and over and down the other side and tunneling underneath it and passing drugs through it. And, this is all political symbolism. It may reduce in the short run and make it more dangerous, but it's not going to stop it. And so border policing is a system of racialized labor management. Gangs. What we've seen happen is we've seen the problem of violence in Black and brown communities get defined as a gang problem. And then the solution to that problem is gang suppression policing, which is about the most corrupt, most violent, most degrading forms of policing. And it's no accident that so many of the scandals in policing in Los Angeles have been tied to the gang unit. Because the politicians have told them they're going after the worst of the worst, the super predators, the gang bangers. They're not even human beings. You had at one point an LA County sheriff saying, well, we're going to deal with them like we deal with any kind of infestation. We're going to stomp them out, you know, dehumanizing language. And that kind of approach would never be tolerated in a white community. They would use whatever political leverage they have to stop their young people from being treated that way. And they have much more political leverage. And of course, the problems of youth violence are often worse in Black and brown communities, especially the poorest Black and brown communities. But there's a reason those communities are so poor. A long history of systematic racial exploitation. And then when they have problems, instead of solving those problems in ways that address those long histories of abuse, they just heap more abuse on through the mass criminalization and incarceration of those young people. And this reproduces racial inequality in America. Policing has always been an engine of reproducing racial inequality, whether at the border or in the suppression of gangs.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Vitale, for your words, for enlightening us with this conversation. Thank you, Dr. Robinson, Dr. Texeira, and everybody who's participated in the conversation. I want to hand it off to Dr. Powell to go ahead and give his closing remarks.
I guess for the last closing remark is this is not really a question from the public, from the audience, but just more of a statement. This is from Jen. Jen says, "I'm so sorry I missed your talk. I'll have to go back and watch it once it's on YouTube. That bit that I have caught sounds very interesting and extremely new to conversation. You're inspiring me to create groups of social workers, grief counselors, lawyers, et cetera, that can be called alongside police officers. If not called directly, they could show up via police scanners. It's just the funding that holds everything up." So I guess with that, thank you again so much for making the time to speak with us today, for so much of your time. We really appreciate it, and to contribute to our ongoing discussion about race and policing in the United States.
Well, you're most welcome. Thanks everyone for such great questions, and I hope a fruitful conversation, and I wish you all well out there on the West Coast. I only wish I could come out and visit in person, hopefully sometime in the future.
Thank you, Alex. We appreciate it. Really appreciate you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good evening.